It's Turbo time! We are talking about Turbo Kid, which may well be in a fresh shout for one of my favourite movies of 2015, but it might not be one you've heard about just yet, so let me tell you. Turbo Kid is a film from multiple directors and is basically a throwback to the 80s. Now, I'll come on to this again in just a little bit, but basically it takes place in a kind of post-apocalyptic world in the mid-90s. Again, I'll come on to that. And basically follows this kind of this young boy who's been kind of orphaned at a young age, kind of living out in the wilderness, kind of on his own wits. One day he kind of meets this kind of quirky girl who's got her own kind of secret going on, and basically together they kind of try and overthrow a kind of evil warlord played by Michael Ironside in this kind of post-apocalyptic setting. Sounds kind of fairly standard, doesn't it? But I'll kind of delve a little bit deeper. Now, this movie has multiple directors and is a Canadian and I believe New Zealand co-production. And basically this one stars Munro Chambers as the Turbo Kid himself. Obviously you've got Michael Ironside as the big bad guy, and Laurence Leboeuf as Apple. Now she is the kind of the female sidekick, and for me was the standout character of this movie. But let me kind of just rewind about it, because this movie needs a little bit of explaining. This film is a love letter to the kind of the post-apocalyptic kind of straight-to-video movies that we had in the 80s. And like I said, this is basically set in the 90s, but as a post-apocalyptic world. So it's the whole thing of this movie is from the music to the kind of the credits, kind of just the way the film goes. It is really made like it was. It sort of came out of the 1980s, basically, just like kind of some of these kind of like Italian style post-apocalyptic flicks that you would have seen back in the day that were kind of an offshoot of the popularity of the Mad Max films. So this is a load of fun. Now I have to say it kind of plays a little bit like a gory version of Power Rangers if you were to watch it with kind of today's eyes. I think that's probably what you would think. Now, the interesting thing with this world, let me just go through the positives first of all. The actual aesthetics of this film, I think, look fantastic. It's such a kind of good looking film. They've really sort of captured that kind of that vibe, I think, that you kind of would have enjoyed from the films back then. And there's some interesting kind of like little kind of changes that they've made, for example, to the stuff that you've seen. For example, there's no real cars in this film. They see a few wrecks here and there, but no one uses cars. We're assuming because obviously there's fewer and out. So basically, all the chases are all done on pedal bikes, basically, which is kind of fun. Maybe not quite as tension filled as kind of car battles, but I guess it makes more sense where everyone's now just using bikes instead of cars because there's no fuel. I thought the characters were fantastic in this. Like I said, Apple, to me, who is the kind of the female sidekick / love interest, was an absolute standout. When I saw the trailer for this film, I thought I kind of wasn't so keen on her character, but watching the film, I thought she was great and was my absolute favourite character, in the film. But everyone does a good job here. There is a kind of an adult male hero who I felt was somewhat superfluous, but nevertheless, I thought the actual characters as a whole were all fantastic. The soundtrack is brilliant. The titles are brilliant. An absolutely fun-filled movie. Loads of kind of imaginative set pieces as well, including kind of different weapons and sort of special abilities, and just the kind of the aesthetics of the characters. Michael Ironside is kind of chewing this in and he's loving it as this kind of cackling bad guy with his kind of silent number two, this kind of guy in a sort of skeleton mask. All fantastic. Such a great film. Now, let me just go on to some of the kind of the negatives for just a little bit. So the first one here is not necessarily a negative, but I feel it warrants sort of bringing up. Because this film is such a love letter to the 80s, I think you really have to be over sort of 33 or so to kind of really get the most of this film. I feel if you are certainly younger than 30, you're probably not going to get this aesthetic that it's sort of going for. So I feel it somewhat kind of limits its audience by its own design. I'm not saying everyone, but I think there's certain sort of younger people who won't understand or won't kind of get why it's sort of so quiche, basically, and kind of it has this kind of throwback feel. But certainly, if you're sort of in your 30s or upwards, basically, and you were a fan of these kind of like lower budget sci-fi films back in the sort of the 80s and the early 90s, you're absolutely going to love this movie. But I'm just going to kind of circle back to that a little bit again, because I feel, even though it kind of does this on purpose, it sort of warrants bringing it up. Some of the plot points in this film I feel were a little bit undercooked. Now, I think this is by design. Now, when we look back at these films, people will just sort of, we'll find a kind of a random special weapon and we'll just kind of accept that it's there. But I think if you've got to realistically look at this, I think the Turbo Kid, for example, finds this kind of this weapon. I'm trying not to give away too many spoilers, but we're not really told anything about it. We're not really told, where it comes from. Basically, the Turbo Kid is character, basically, he's kind of idolizes this comic book character, and I just it's this superhero of this kind of world. But did this guy exist in real life? We don't kind of know. So some of the ideas here I just felt were a little kind of underdeveloped. Like I said, I felt like it was maybe by design, but even so, I still felt that it could have had a little bit more sort of backstory in what was going on and things like that. And I guess the only other kind of criticism, and this is, I'm really struggling to find much wrong with this film, if I'm honest with you, because I enjoyed it so much. But some of the action set pieces as well, some of the way the action was directed, it slowed down in certain times. Now, this film had multiple directors, and sometimes I feel you can kind of feel the action just kind of like lose momentum from time to time. So, and I think that's probably the case of where we've had so many directors in this movie. But I don't want to rag on this movie because it's such a fun film. It's a real sort of feel-good factor. It does kind of come across when you watch this film. It has a kind of certain sort of Power Rangers-esque vibe. But don't get me wrong, even though I think there's a lot to kind of say this is almost like a kids film, and it plays a little bit like a kids film. It's extremely gory. Gore is kind of a little OTT, so it's not realistic gore, but there's a high level of violence, exploding people getting buzzsaws in their faces, things like that. Again, reminiscent of these great 80s films that you would have seen. But it's a fun film. I should definitely check this one out. It is one of my favourite films that I've seen this year. If you were kind of a fan of Mad Max Fury Road, but you kind of want something a little bit more sort of tongue-in-cheek, then I would suggest checking this one out. It's certainly not as visceral as obviously Mad Max Fury Road, but I certainly feel if you enjoyed that film and you kind of like the something a little bit more campy, maybe you're going to get a big kick out of this one. Really, very sort of small minor points, I would say. I've thoroughly enjoyed this film. It's certainly one of my best films of this year. I'm going to give this movie an 8.5 out of 10. Highly, highly recommend it. Go check it out, and thanks for watching. Bye for now.